Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at a massive shift happening right now. Why is the traditional economic engine of Europe suddenly stalling out? For decades, Germany has been the undisputed powerhouse of export-led growth. But a brutal convergence of external shocks and internal vulnerabilities has basically fractured that reality. So let's look strictly at the data to understand the mechanics of this crisis.
To really grasp the severity of this situation, we've got to start with this number, 0.6%. The Macroeconomic Policy Institute, or IMK, recently issued a drastic downgrade to Germany's 2026 GDP growth, projecting a mere 0.6% expansion for the entire year. This represents a huge drop from their prior forecasts, and it signals a fundamental shift in the macroeconomic trajectory of Europe's largest economy.
So here's how we're going to unpack this massive downgrade. We'll cover the 2026 downgrade itself, the Strait of Hormuz shock, consumer and corporate paralysis, the state's fiscal band-aids, the steep demographic cliff, and finally, the ultimate prognosis, cure or chronic stagnation.
Section 1. The 2026 Economic Downgrade, a Synchronized Institutional Diagnosis.
What's really wild about these projections is the totally undeniable synchronized consensus. Whether you're checking the IMK, the Bundesbank, the Ministry of Economics, or the IMF, they are all projecting the German economy will struggle just to break a 1% growth threshold over the next 2 years. It is, frankly, incredibly rare to see this level of uniform pessimism from both domestic and international macroeconomic authorities. They all see a highly complex, dual-pronged crisis playing out.
Moving on to Section 2. The Strait of Hormuz shock, an acute cyclical injury.
To understand exactly what triggered this injury, think about how fast the ground shifted. Back in early 2026, global energy markets actually had a slight surplus. But then, late February hits. Escalating hostilities in the Middle East involving the US, Israel, and Iran severely restrict oil tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Literally overnight, an estimated 9 to 10 million barrels per day of crude oil were essentially lost or severely delayed. For Germany, an economy heavily reliant on importing cheap energy to produce advanced chemicals, metals, and machinery, this maritime supply shock cascaded through the domestic economy almost instantly.
The really crucial takeaway here? This headline energy shock birthed a seriously stubborn core inflation crisis. It wasn't just gas getting more expensive. We're talking industrial plastics, metals, transport, all surging. As everyday workers saw their purchasing power erode under massive utility and grocery bills, powerful trade unions naturally negotiated steep wage increases. To cover these higher labor costs in a weak market, companies were forced to raise final consumer prices. This created a self-sustaining wage-price dynamic that effectively locked higher inflation right into the structural foundation of the economy.
Section 3. Consumer and corporate paralysis. The vitals are crashing.
And the fallout is obvious in the numbers. The consumer climate indicator absolutely plummeted to negative 33.3 points in the spring of 2026. When people are terrified that their future income is going to be totally devoured by heating and food bills, discretionary spending just shuts down. Terrified households are hoarding cash, breaking the piggy bank only for the bare essentials, and indefinitely postponing major purchases like cars and homes.
And it's definitely not just everyday shoppers panicking. Corporate management is, well, equally paralyzed. A staggering 70% of companies now cite energy and raw material prices as their absolute paramount business risk. When your business model relies entirely on affordable energy, and those costs suddenly skyrocket with literally no end in sight, what do? You halt construction, you delay equipment investments, you stop upgrading machinery. This corporate pessimism means the very investments needed to grow the economy out of the slump are being universally paused.
That brings us to Section 4, the State Fiscal Band-Aid, Life Support Measures.
So, to prevent an outright freefall, the government is leaning super heavily into deficit spending. We're talking unprecedented off-budget defense funding, part of that massive policy shift known as Zeitenwende, and huge green energy investments. But the most contentious band-aid is CSEF. Think of this as a €3.8 billion state aid lifeline, heavily subsidizing electricity for energy-hungry industrial companies. It's a desperate move to prevent mass deindustrialization, even if it comes with staggering amounts of red tape.
But here's the massive dilemma. This fiscal IV drip keeps the patient alive today, sure, but it is incredibly expensive. The general government deficit is projected to balloon, potentially hitting a really alarming 4.9% by 2028. This directly threatens to cut through Germany's strict constitutional debt brake, the Schuldenbremse. Institutes warn unequivocally that this expansion sets the stage for deeply painful tax hikes or severe cuts to social services by the end of the decade.
Which leads us to Section 5, the steep demographic cliff, the chronic underlying disease.
Now, you might remember that over 25 years ago, Germany was dubbed the sick man of Europe. The label is back, but the illness today is fundamentally different. Back in '99, the issue was high unemployment and a rigid labor market. They cured that with reforms and enjoyed a golden decade of export dominance. The 2026 sick man, on the other hand, is suffering from the exact opposite problem, a catastrophic, structural shortage of skilled labor. Even as the economy slows down, companies are literally hoarding workers because they're terrified they won't be able to hire them back later.
To put the sheer scale of the shortage into perspective, think about this math. Over the next decade, 20 million older baby boomers are going to hit retirement age and walk out the door. Due to decades of low birth rates, only 12.5 million younger individuals will enter to replace them. That leaves an impossible 7.5 million person shortfall. This isn't just a temporary dip, it is a permanent, steep demographic cliff. As economic expert Veronica Grimm so bluntly points out, Germany's economic weakness has actually persisted for 7 years now. Think about that. The Strait of Hormuz energy shock didn't break the German economy out of nowhere. It really just amplified a foundational rot that has been quietly growing for nearly a decade, and it is deeply structural.
When we review the full medical history, we see a pretty lethal combination of burdens. You've got the heavy weight of suffocating bureaucracy and high labor costs eroding global competitiveness. You have chronic underinvestment leaving transport and energy grids fractured. And perhaps most worryingly, a really pronounced technological lag. By relying so heavily on traditional mechanical engineering, Germany is left highly vulnerable to the fast-moving AI and digital innovations led by the US and China.
Finally, Section 6, Cure or Chronic Stagnation, the Final Prognosis.
To truly understand the trap Germany finds itself in right now, we have to talk about potential output. Because of that massive demographic cliff we just discussed, Germany's potential output is grinding to an absolute standstill. This means the overall speed limit of the economy is dropping. Therefore, even a seemingly sluggish 0.6% GDP growth actually outstrips the economy's capacity. The economy constantly feels like it's running too hot, forcing the European Central Bank into a super tight corner where they can't easily lower interest rates to stimulate growth without sparking even more inflation.
Ultimately, the immediate future is almost entirely held hostage by global geopolitics. Forecasters are looking at two very distinct paths here. There's an optimistic peace scenario, where a ceasefire normalizes shipping routes, which could push 2026 growth up slightly to 0.8% as energy costs fall. But then, there's the prolonged disruption scenario, where oil spikes to $120 a barrel and just stays there. That promises a truly devastating drop in growth to just 0.2%, accompanied by inflation surging right back up.
All of which leaves us with this final, incredibly vital question. The traditional German model, cheap imported energy, unfettered global trade, and robust Chinese demand, it's structurally incompatible with today's fractured world. So, will Germany push past these temporary band-aids to execute the painful, radical structural reforms required to survive? Or is it destined for an era of permanent stagnation? Thanks for walking through this explainer with me. Keep a close eye on this space. The decisions made over the next few years are absolutely going to shape the very future of Europe.